Hello, another episode of the Waterloo Advantage. I'm Dhruv Patel, one of your hosts, a third-year mechatronics engineering student, and co-hosting with me is Varun Kundra, a third-year math student. Today we have another very special guest, Eric Lee, who will be talking about his co-op experiences as a software engineer and working at startups. So welcome, Eric. Could you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Eric. I am a second year computer engineering student. I actually off, founded my own startup and then decided to go back to school. And so here I am, continuing my studies at the university.
All right, sounds good. There's definitely a lot to talk about. How about we start with your co-ops? So I understand you co-opted twice at Lacework. So can you tell us more about Lacework, what they do, and sort of your role there?
Yeah, sure. Actually, can I start with a little story maybe?
Sure, yeah.
This might put some things into perspective. So in my very first co-op, so I worked at a company called Nuance. And there's a funny story about how I got the job. Everybody knows about, at least at Waterloo, that we have a Waterloo Works job board. And so I guess the first year, I was a Stream 4 computer engineering student, which meant I had to find co-op immediately. Stream 4s have to search in 1A. And so, 2 weeks into class, I'm looking for jobs and I
Yeah.
had literally no experience. And so I'm looking for these jobs and I apply, everybody applies for these jobs and I'm not getting anything. And so I decided to try looking for jobs outside of Waterloo Works. And so found a couple interesting places in Montreal. And so I was like, Montreal's a cool city. Might as well apply there. And so what happened was um, I got matched actually with a job through Waterloo Works. And it was for something completely unrelated to what I wanted to do, like software engineering. And I was like, I don't really want to work there. And so I actually got an offer for the job, for a software engineering job in Montreal. And so I reneged on my unrelated job. And then Waterloo Works kind of banned me. And so this is just to give some perspective about what happens in the next co-op. And so they banned me from Waterloo Works. And what that means is I can't use Waterloo Works for 2 terms, which includes the term, the next term after. So I went to Nuance, had a good time, and then so now it's summer of 2019, and now I'm looking for jobs again. But this time I can't use Waterloo Works, and so I'm like, oh crap! I'm kind of screwed, right? Can't use the job board. How am I supposed to find jobs? And then I remembered, right, the previous term, I had used Waterloo Works, and I had some contacts sending out some emails and things like that. So what I did was instead of using Waterloo Works because I couldn't, I decided to go a different route. And I started cold emailing recruiters at companies that I was interested in working at. And so at Lacework, I found Lacework in my inbox. And this was a company that I really wanted to work for in my first term. And so I had applied to them. They were on Waterloo Works. But unfortunately, I didn't have the skill set and the qualifications and so on to, I guess, get the job at that point. But now with some experience, so I emailed the recruiter directly, right? This was a month before you were supposed to go on co-op. And so somehow magically I got a reply from the recruiter the next day and he's like, yeah, sure. You want to schedule an interview? And so this was again, 3 weeks before we were supposed to go on co-op. I was unemployed, no job. And so I was like, yeah, sure. Let's do an interview. I'm down. And then the recruiter scheduled me for an interview the next day. And so within 3 or 4 days, I had my interview and I cleared it. And I was able to go on I did do a co-op at a startup in California. And so for me, that was holy crap. Yeah, from being unemployed to having a job that was my dream job, at least, as a software engineering intern at a security company. Yeah, that was wow, it happened so fast. And so I guess that's the premise, the story before I got the job. And then of course, let's talk about, I guess, my first time there. So yeah, so when I went to Lacework, this was my first time working in the US, first time in California, had no idea what to expect really. And so I guess my first kind of couple days, it was really a whole new experience. And the thing is that, so I guess this is just a thing that I kind of learned over past couple of years, but working at a startup, I think, is a really, really good way to get like good experience. And it's something I recommend for everybody to at least get an experience of working at a startup because you get to do a lot of things that you might not get to do at like a bigger company, for example, just because at startups, things move so quickly and there's not a lot of room for like staying behind. And so things have to move quickly, and that means there's more opportunities for you to pick up new things, for you to learn and work on projects. Um, and I just in general, I think the atmosphere it's really good for learning, and so I do recommend that. And so I guess my first internship there, kind of learning their system. Obviously, I still got to work on a cool couple cool things, and so most of it, my work was related to the back end. So I did a lot of backend engineering, got a lot of backend engineering experience. Like for example, working with Docker, Kubernetes. I built like a testing framework for microservices, and I also worked on a custom query language translator. So it was kind of like it basically compiles. So this custom language that compiles into or translates, I should say, the query language into like dynamically generated SQL, and it was supposed to like help basically retrieve data models and make it easier to like write these instead of writing like 200 line SQLs. You just have to write like 2 or 3 lines of this query language. It's super powerful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. That's a hell of a story just to get into Lacework. And I'm sure like they recognize that initiative a lot, right? That's what I'm guessing. They really value it.
Yeah, I was a little bit of luck there too. I mean, I did get the recruiter's email because he did send me an email prior saying that unfortunately they didn't have a space for me in my first year, like first semester. And then so I was digging through my inbox and this was like, I'm stuck, right? Like I need a job. I'm like struggling. I'm kind of stressed. And so yeah,
Right.
it just so happened I was trying, right? I was trying like, whatever I could do to get a job. And at that point, I'm like, okay, emailing recruiters, right? Direct messaging on LinkedIn. I'm applying to jobs on like job boards, asking people for help, referrals,
Yeah.
etc. Just doing what I can right? Because at that point, you're basically getting to the point where it's like I'm desperate, right? Like if it's 2 weeks before, your job is supposed to start and you don't have a job, right? That's when you're starting to get worried. So, yeah.
Right. Right. So can you explain just for our listeners like the basics of what Lacework does?
Yeah, sure. So Lacework is a cloud security startup. So essentially, they provide a SaaS platform. So customers, I guess any kind of customer who has like computational resources in the cloud, for example, like most companies, software companies, even non-software companies that just have like things operating in the cloud or operate their services, et cetera, their environments. The idea is the cloud environments, everybody's moving to cloud. It's not super safe yet, right? Like the security aspect of it is super important because a lot of people are moving to the cloud, right? But you have to make sure that the environments are safe, right? Make sure that the data is protected and that like malicious attackers can't get access to your environments or like hack your stuff, basically. And so what Lacework does is we provide a platform which it's like 2 or 3-fold. It contains like the SaaS platform in which people can monitor their environments, but also have like a lot of features related to like anomaly detection, and there's some machine learning algorithms and models that kind of help kind of see what normal usage of environment is and what abnormal behavior looks like. And so there's a lot of interesting problems to be solved in that space about like related to how to correlate data. And I guess most of it is like data problems. And so, yeah, the idea is cloud environments need to be secured. And Lacework is the platform, like a SaaS platform in which like customers can use the platform to see, right, keep a track of how their environments are doing, the health, and so on. And so the way Lacework kind of does that is we basically ingest data and do a lot of interesting things with it to find out what's really going on.
That's super cool. And, just to get sort of an idea of like, do you know what like sort of industries Lacework operates in? Any like interesting clients or customers that you can?
Yeah, I mean, so what I can get into, I guess, in terms of like sectors, it's wide. Like there's wide market penetration, I would say. A lot of software companies definitely are interested because a lot of software companies have environments in the cloud, right? Like if they're running AWS, running GCP, running Azure, and so Lacework can be used on all of those kind of platforms. And then nowadays, I mean, they're expanding into a lot of different areas. I haven't been working there since like last year, but in the time, I guess, when I was there, like they were working on like getting into containers. That was something that was really big because everyone's moving into cloud, right? And then plus the containerization, Kubernetes and Docker are becoming like industry standards. And so there's support for that as well, like inspection and containers, see what's going on inside containers, things like that, because a lot of people are taking advantage of this too. As people are moving to containers, there's not as much like focus, I think, when people are working with containers, they're talking about like, okay, how do I get it to work? Not necessarily like, oh my God, like somebody might like get into my app via a container, right? Like maybe there's a security issue, et cetera. And so I think with more and more like migration to cloud and things like that, this is becoming at least something that's super important, like security, and it can often be overlooked because like people in industry, like they're trying to deploy their features and satisfy customers and clients and things like that, and oftentimes security just becomes like not a primary concern anymore, which is not a good thing, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And just to sort of get an idea of like how much companies are valuing it at, like just like a rough estimate of like, do you know like what percent of their budget, or like what's like an average contract size at Lacework, just to get an idea of like how this really is to companies?
Well, it varies, I guess, right? So depending on the company, it probably can't go too deep into like the numbers per se, but
yeah,
the ranges for sure. Like we're looking at maybe 6-7 figure contracts, right? Depending on company size and their needs and things like that, because different customers want different things. And so every customer is different, right? They might want more of the service, like more features. Some other customers might need less of it. And so it really depends.
Yeah, that's super interesting. The 6-7 figures is quite big, but I guess the clients are also quite big.
Yeah, it really depends on the clients, right? Like there are startups, or not startups, but like smaller companies that do use this, right? And obviously we're looking at like also large enterprise companies, right? And so and so they kind of pick up customers as they go, and then so it really, I think nowadays, I mean, the customer in terms of like not sure about the numbers per se, but like let's just say Lacework is doing well and they're really picking up in terms of like revenue and customer numbers and growth and things like that. So yeah, looks like this industry is pretty hot. So
for sure. And sort of just like, what made you particularly sort of interested in working there? Like you mentioned, it was your dream job, right? So why software engineering?
Yeah, at least okay. So yeah. In first year, 1A, I mean, coming into university, I'm super interested in computers, right? And then I'm looking at like particularly in the field of security. I think that was something I was interested in as a kid. I used to like play around with a lot of like Linux servers and like basically try to figure out how to break into things. I was like, exploratory, right? Like, I mean, I read a lot about like security and those like capture the flag type games and things like that. Those were super fun. When I was in high school, I used to participate in those. And so security was particularly interesting industry for me. I mean, I didn't really know, I guess, what it really meant in terms of like greater context, right, for companies, like how important it could be for companies or like how it is used in industry per se. But I had a good idea of like, okay, this is something that's kind of interesting, right? Like attackers, it's so easy. Like sometimes it looks so easy. And so I wanted to figure out, right? Like I want to learn more about this space. And then I found a few companies on Waterlooworks that were in the security domain. And most of them were startups and most of them were in the Bay Area. And so I was like, okay, you know what? Just give it a shot, right? It doesn't hurt. So I was like reading about their job description, doing research on the company and so on. I was like, oh, this is really cool, right? Like, cloud security. Like, what is that? I have no idea, but it's something to do with security. And I was like, okay. So you read about it and it's like, okay, so they're doing some particularly I was like reading about it. It's like, okay, their backend systems are like doing this data processing probably, and it looks really complicated. And so I was like, okay, I think this would be a good place to get some good experience, at least in that domain, right? Like I wouldn't really know what like I would work on as a software engineer. I was like, maybe I would work on their systems, but not super sure. Like, what does it mean, right? Am I doing security work, or am I doing like what am I doing? I wasn't really sure, I guess, when I initially applied. But then when I was talking to the recruiters and stuff, and they were talking like the recruiter was telling me about like how they kind of operate and what it meant, I guess, like how they were helping customers and clients. I mean, that got me hooked. And so I was like, yeah, this is it. Like I want to try this out, right? So that's kind of how I decided to pursue internship there.
For sure.
Okay. And I was wondering, like, how did it, did it feel different running code for a security startup versus like your first company, Nuance?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so in terms of like this, so this is actually kind of nice. Nuance was a bigger company. They're a multinational company. And so, I mean, they're bigger, right? More established. And so the kind of projects I was working on there, they were awesome. Like, I mean, I had fun learning. At least for my first internship, that was a really good experience, for sure. And I mean, I got to work in the industry, get a taste, right? It was my first time working as a software engineer or software developer in the industry, and kind of seeing how things run, right? Like working with team members on the team, working with managers, stakeholders, etc. So that was a really good experience. But I think for me, something I noticed when I was working there was that things move like a lot slower than I kind of anticipated. So things don't go as quickly. And that's not really, I mean, that's not the fault of the company per se. That's just how big companies are, I think. Things take a lot of time, processes, and like, because there's a huge hierarchy and decisions kind of trickle down and so on. And it takes a while, right? Like in terms of communicating with everybody and like figuring out, right, what to achieve this quarter, for example, and things like that. It takes a while, it takes a lot of planning. And so they can't really move as quickly. And so I felt that at times, like I was pretty kind of slow, right? Maybe at sometimes there wasn't a lot of things to work on. And so, I'm trying to look for things to work on, asking my manager and so on. And they would have to spend some time to figure out what to like assign or kind of get going. And so it wasn't as fast. And that's why why I was looking towards startups, because I know at startups, it was like, it made sense that things had to move quickly, right? Startups need to grow. Startups need to move quickly in order to grow. And so I was thinking, right, maybe if I work at a startup, then things will move a lot quicker, and it would be a good opportunity to learn a lot of new things. And it turns out that's kind of true. It is the case at startups where like the pace is going, right, and like there's so many things you could work on, right? Projects are going constantly. The team is working on multiple things at the same time. At startups, you tend to wear many hats. And when I was at Lacework, it was pretty nice where you could like kind of work on whatever you wanted to work on and like talk to whoever you wanted to talk to. It wasn't as siloed as, say, in a big company. I mean, you're not really interacting with a lot of the other people in the company. At Lacework, when I first joined, I mean, everybody, pretty much everybody that worked for the company, I would say like, so 70 or 80 people out of like 100 or a bit over 100 were working in HQ. Or something like that. I was like, I think maybe it was 70 people, a little bit under that were working in HQ, and maybe like 20, 30 engineers, something like that. And so, like, not even 20, 30 engineers. When I first joined, it was probably a little less than that. But by then, right, like that's the whole company. Like all the engineers are there. And so like it was super cool. Like you could just walk up to anybody, talk to them. The whole company's there. You get to like have the CEO would host weekly meetings. And things were just like, it was a lot more tight knit, I would say, like in terms of the whole company, at least when they were starting out. Now, I mean, they're pretty established. I think they just raised a big round and they're worth over $1 billion and so on. But at least when I started, it was really nice to have that kind of switch from big company type environment to small and fast.
That's awesome. It seems like working at a startup obviously influenced you, and you went out and built your own startup after. Yeah, I think this is a great segue into that. Like, tell us more about that. Like, what was it? How'd you get started? Yeah, just all the details.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about that. So I was wrapping up my internship, like my first internship at Lacework. This was by like, I think November, December kind of. And so I guess the really first time I kind of worked on this idea, like heard about this idea, was for a friend. And my friend was actually had an idea. He was interviewing for YC, and he flew down and he wanted to meet up. And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, why not, right? Like, I want to see what you're working on and stuff. And so we went to a coffee shop. I remember it was like downtown Mountain View, Pete's Coffee. We came down, we just met up at a coffee shop, and he's like, I gotta show you this thing. And so he pulls out his laptop and he's like showing me like what he's working on. And he's like, this is what we kind of built at some hackathon. And he's like, I've got a YC interview. This is what we're presenting at YC. And I was like, okay. I was looking at the app. I was like, dang, this is like a pretty good idea. Like, so what he was kind of showing me was just like kind of rough, I guess, kind of a prototype-ish of something he was working on, which was a documentation tool. Initially, I guess it was kind of like a documentation tool. It wasn't fully sketched, like hashed out, but it essentially was like for code documentation, or at least documentation for like when people are writing code for developers. But it wasn't super hashed out about like what it was for or how it was going to be used, etc. And so he was like, okay, he's like making his presentation and things like that. And I was like, dang, this is really cool, right? I would use this. Because the problems I was facing at companies that I worked at before, like so both at the startup and also at Nuance, something I realized was that documentation is actually super important. And it wasn't something that people will try to like drive processes and like make sure people write documentation, but it often becomes like an afterthought for developers. Developers aren't thinking like actively like, oh, I want to write documentation. Like I want to write documentation for this code, right? Like no, like I want to finish my code. I want to test my code, deploy it, right? Verify it matches the requirement stack and features, etc., and like do regression testing and things like that. And I think documentation at that point becomes afterthought, and nobody really wants to. I mean, I guess if you're a seasoned developer, maybe you do want to write it, but like I think most developers would agree that it takes up a lot of time, and it's not something that is really the number one thing right on their list to do. And so I was like this, and then as a result of that, right, documentation easily becomes outdated, and it's not super easy, right, to figure out what's going on when you join a new company, for example, and like you're getting engineers to onboard. There are a lot of things sometimes in code bases that are really quirky and weird, and it would be really hard for new developers, especially junior developers, I think, particularly, to really like onboard to a code base well, right, without constant like mentorship from like senior developers and like at least getting help from the rest of the like people in the company. And so I was like, this is great, right? This would help a lot. You could like insert documentation into your IDE, like into like as an editor plugin. And so, and then I was like thinking what the potential was, right? You could like sync this across different Git branches. You could like, there's so many things you could do with this thing, right? And you could like make it run basically, and it would essentially help solve a large problem in industry revolving around internal documentation in companies. And so I guess we were chatting about that, and then so he went to do his interview, and I guess later on, this was like December, I was at work and he called me and because he saw, I guess, that I was super excited about it. And so he told me, he's like, hey, he's like, we got into like my company taking it to YC, and he's like, I need a co-founder, and he's like, I want to ask you. And I was like, so I was like thinking about it. I'm like, yeah. So I needed some time, obviously, to think about that decision because that was pretty big, right? Like, essentially, what that meant was like I had to quit school, for good, basically, for as long. And the idea was like, you have to come join me. We go down to California, work on this thing. And so I needed time to think about that because that's like a big left turn in my life. And so I took a couple days. It took me 4 days to decide what to do, which I would say is not a very long time, if all things considered, because probably people would spend a lot more time thinking about that, right? Like, should I drop out of school, like presumably for a very long time, right? Like upwards of 10 to 15 years, 20 years maybe, and like go work on this thing, or should I not do it, right? And miss the opportunity. And I talked to a bunch of people about this. I talked to the CTO at Lacework. We had a chat, kind of figure out what my goals were and things like that. And he was like, either way, right, things will work out. Even if it doesn't work out, like with this startup, or it doesn't work out, or you don't decide to do it, whatever it is, he's like, you just make the best decision that you can, and make a decision that you know you won't regret from now, right? And I was thinking about, I was like, okay, like obviously there are going to be a lot of opportunities where I can work on a startup, probably in the future, right? Like opportunities don't just like, it's not a one-time thing. Like, okay, like you only get one offer to work on a startup and then you never get to work on one again. But I like this kind of opportunity, like it came up. And so I was like, would I regret turning it down, right? To work on this particular idea and like make this thing come real. And I thought about it and I was like, yeah, so if I didn't do this thing, right, then I would probably likely regret not trying it.
Okay.
And so that's why that was kind of the driving decision factor, I guess, that led me to saying yes. And so I was on board. And so obviously before I could actually join, like I had to like have my interview with YC and so on. And then so I did my interview, talk with the partners and things like that. And then I mean they gave me the green light. And then yeah, so my co-founder and I, we flew to California in January and we just started building this thing.
And you know, how was your experience with Y Combinator, both the interview and then the actual program?
Yeah, so so my interview was a little bit different and obviously than what regular people would like regular interviews would be. So I can't really say too much about what the regular interview is kind of like. But my interview was not as, I would say, maybe intense. It was still, I mean, they grilled me. At least I got a call from a YC partner and they kind of grilled me on a variety of things and just make sure like I'm, fully committed and things like that. And just get a feel for what I think the vision was for the company and things like that. And then after that, I mean, joining YC, like I would say the experience is rather interesting. I think it was definitely one of a kind. When you go to YC, I mean, so it's a startup incubator, and I guess they're pretty famous for producing like a lot or backing a lot of companies that ultimately became quite successful. I mean, so like Airbnb, Dropbox, Reddit, companies like those. I mean, so they're pretty well known, I think, in the world about like, like people who go through a program and things like that. So the experience, I mean, working with people there, I think was really interesting because they had a lot of, I guess, insights. So the partners there, the people who kind of run this program, they have a lot of interesting experiences and insights about working because they're working with companies every batch, right? There's 2 batches per year and like a couple hundred companies going through each batch. And I mean, some of these partners have been working there for several years now, right? Or even more. And they've seen like hundreds, if not thousands of startups, right? Like, and they know like what kills startups and they know what makes startups like put on the right path, right? To put people on the right path. Obviously, they're not gonna like solve all your problems or you make your startup successful because they don't know, right? Like nobody really knows if your startup is gonna be the one that's gonna be successful. But they can definitely offer like super good advice about like, okay, this is gonna make you like run off the rails and kill your startup, for example. They'll know what will do that, right? Like, or like they'll know, okay, if you do this, this is generally like a good idea. So like I think those things already like are super helpful, right? Because I mean, it's so easy to just kill your startup. Startups die, right? Most startups do die. And so with like some help, right, you might be able to stay afloat rather than like, okay, it's doomed. That I think the experience there, and like I mean, meeting a lot of interesting people. I mean, everybody like that's there, like as founders, are I guess super motivated and driven, right, to make their startup become next big thing. And you get to see like all these different companies, what they're working on, the different sectors, the different people and personalities, and then what people are actually, I guess, like different stages of companies as well, right? Like companies that go through ICR aren't just your like just startup, right? Like just started getting going. Some startups that go through YC are actually established already. Like there are startups that go in with like 500,000 annual revenue kind of thing, or even more. And there are startups that are pre-revenue with like a couple users that are like not paying, et cetera. So you have like the whole spectrum of like different startups at different stages. Some startups have raised money already. Some startups are looking to raise more money, things like that. And so I think the experience there, like seeing the diversity of the like the people and the companies and the ideas and things like that was super interesting. In terms of the actual, like, I guess how kind of YC works, I mean, um, essentially they have this program prepared that kind of helps founders, right, navigate like basic stuff. They have like a little boot camp that kind of teaches you basics of like marketing, sales, etc., things like that. They have a lot of talks with like speakers. So yeah, you get like a few like either speaker like founders, former founders will speak at these events, or you just you kind of have like these events every week basically. And there's also like a dinner, I guess. And so every week you get like speakers, you get some sort of event, and you get like this dinner where you can like chat with other people and um, like attend the YC events basically. And then at the end, obviously, the big, I guess, part of YC is demo day, in which you kind of present to a big crowd of investors. And that's kind of how, kind of from the culmination of the event, it's a good way to get your like product and your vision to investors and then raise money, hopefully. So that's kind of the idea. And so unfortunately, yeah, the timing for the bat when I was in the batch, it was not super great. Like unfortunately, pandemic kind of hit, and investors, I think at least in the beginning, right? Because our demo day was supposed to be in March, and um, we were going to have a demo day basically in person. They canceled, and it was going to be online, and so that was like a big shocker, I think, for a lot of people because this is like the first time they ever did demo day online. And I mean, it was like I guess the VC slash like investors side of things, they definitely tightened up a lot and during that time because like it was just the pandemic just hit and the economic conditions were kind of uncertain moving forward. And so it was really the environment for raising money became a lot tougher, I think, at least initially. And so, I mean, the thing we were working on, we weren't at a stage where like we could easily just like go out and raise money. I would say like traction, things like that, and at least the idea we were still working on it. But yeah, all things considered, I mean, it was really hard to navigate that kind of environment. And then plus we had to leave the country at that point. I mean, we were like thinking we got to leave because they were going to close down the country or something like that. And yeah, just it wasn't going to be like really great. So we were just like, okay, let's go. And so we actually left, I guess, mid-March kind of, and flew back to Canada. And so unfortunately, we weren't able to participate in the online demo day at that point. So yeah.
All right. So yeah, that's quite the experience. One thing I was thinking, it was like, I feel like when I hear about YC, like I already expect a lot of these things because I mean, personally at least, I've heard about it so much. So was there something like that was particularly surprising or like unexpected that you thought YC offered?
Yeah, I mean, so like obviously the things that I kind of talked about that are kind of known, I mean, that's helpful. I think the something that was particularly interesting, at least, I mean, beyond, I guess, like the people in your batch. I mean, I think listening to speakers like talk about their experiences and things like that, because they kind of dive into like their experiences, right? And then they kind of open up a lot of things. And like you get to really hear like what really they were thinking about, right? Instead of just kind of what people think they were thinking about. And so I think those kind of insights, particularly, were super helpful in terms of like at least learning about startups and kind of what it takes, and like what led people to do what they did. And hearing about all that, I think definitely helped a lot. And so in terms of like other not so well-known things, I mean, okay, I guess, I mean, this is kind of well known, I suppose, but like working with partners, so every kind of group, like batch, they divide you up into like groups, and then you work with basically like group partners. And so most of the group partners are either ex-founders or founders slash like moved into a different role after they were a founder, And so they have a lot of startup experience. Plus, like maybe they were partners for like quite a few years now, and so these guys have like a lot of experience. And I think one thing was finding a partner, or finding partners that were experienced in your space was something that was particularly important. Like it kind of makes sense. I mean, you want to find somebody who knows, like, but I
Yeah.
think that was something particularly important because, so I mean, they divided us up kind of into groups, right? And then you kind of work with partners, and sometimes they tried their best to basically align, like make groups such that, right, the partners you work with in your group are partners that kind of, but sometimes it didn't really line up exactly, right? Because sometimes they don't even know what you're working on really, right? Like they do know because you do your presentation and so on, but maybe they don't really know what your vision is, right, for it, or like exactly how you kind of envision it. And so I think finding the partners that really know how to help you, like move you along, or like have connections in your space, etc., like using them as a resource was something that was particularly useful, and can often be like hard to find, right? Like maybe you don't know all the partners, you don't know who knows who or who knows what, etc. And so I think that was something, yeah, that would be quite useful. And then the other thing was, so oftentimes it was actually hard to find. So if you're a company, I mean, so for example, I'll just give an example. Like if you're working on a social app, for example, there are partners there that have done social apps like really well, right? Like i.e. Twitch, for example, or
Yeah.
maybe some other partners have like a lot of experience like with marketplaces, right? Maybe they've founded a company that essentially is a marketplace that connects like creative designers with like people who want to purchase that, right? And so for some things, like obviously it's really easy to find, but maybe for some other not so straightforward like spaces, it was a lot tougher. So some people were working on these companies, um, and it was really hard for them to find partners that really understood what they were working on and like had experience in that particular space, because maybe no partner has ever worked on something in that area. And so that was like, yeah, that could pose a challenge. And I think with that in mind, yeah, so that's something I thought like I mean, I guess it's an improvement maybe in the future. They could definitely, um, yeah, it's hard, right? Because they have a lot of partners and so on. And so they already cover a lot of ground. But it was definitely, I found, I was
Right.
talking to some of my batchmates, some people found it tougher, especially because they just didn't have like the right mentor, right? Or like the right person that they felt would be able to help them the best. But in overall, I mean, experience was pretty good. I would say well worth it, right? Like aside from, like there's small hiccups here and there. And I guess in terms of like another thing I kind of noticed was, so they took a lot of companies this time. And so I know that YC, like taking a lot of companies and like trying to help as many people as they can, like I get that, right? Like that seems like a really good idea and it makes a lot of sense. But I find that it kind of loses something, right? Like even though you're in these groups, right? And these groups are small, right? Because the whole batch is like gigantic. And they divide you up into these groups to make it kind of smaller, to kind of emulate what it was like many years ago when they first started. But I still feel like it was kind of, that part was a little bit lost, because like the group sizes are still big, right? Back in the day, right? Like back in 2008, was that Reddit, something like that? Back when like Reddit was in the batch, I mean, there was like 20 people or something like that, or like 30 people, right? It was like tiny, like everybody fit at one dinner table. Um, and I think at that point, everybody's super more like tight knit and so on, right? Like everybody knows each other in the batch, right? And at that time, it was Paul Graham and like running it and all, and like
Mm-hmm.
everybody would be able to have the opportunity to speak with Paul Graham, like talk to each other, and kind of work on their startups almost like together, right? Like they're in it together. But now I think because it's so big again, right? Like it just becomes a lot tougher for people to really get to know everybody, right? Like I don't think there's a way for you to like know everybody in your batch anymore, and I feel like some of that is kind of lost because yeah, just there's less of that like stickiness between people. So I get why they did that, and I understand like the reasoning to help as many startups as they can and things like that. But um, that's the sacrifice that I guess they decided to go with, was to yeah, take a lot of people and then just make it a little less tight knit between, I guess, founders and like everybody in the batch.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds super interesting. There's some really good insights on Y Combinator as a whole. So is the startup that you were working on still going? And I understand you're back in school right now. So are you still working on it?
Yeah, so no. My co-founder and I, we talked about this, I guess back in March. Um, it wasn't picking up as fast as we wanted it to in terms of like traction. And the space is particularly difficult to navigate. That was something we discovered working on our startup. The documentation space is not as straightforward, I guess, at least the internal documentation space. So we were thinking about how to like expand this, right? Like we were thinking, okay, so internal documentation for a lot of companies we talked to was just not that important. Right? Like for startups, they just didn't care, like at all, flat out didn't care. We talked to mid-sized companies. Mid-sized companies like place greater emphasis on, at least the ones that were hiring. They placed emphasis on documentation, make it easier for like new hires to like onboard. But again, it wasn't as important to them as well, right? Like they had internal tools that would help them with that. So like, for example, they would be using Confluence or whatever to document their stuff and put like comments in their code. And it was like, quote unquote, good enough, right? They wasn't sure if it was worth like integrating a entirely new tool into their workflow. And so that left the big companies. And so we were talking to big companies, and big companies were actually quite interested in what we were working on, right? Because big companies tend to the one that have like the turnover and the like hires coming in and go like coming in and leaving all the time, and so like documentation was kind of like important for them. But we ran into a lot of little issues because I think documentation, at least working on documentation as like a developer, right? Developers, it's really hard to convince them to like pick up this tool to like for documentation purposes. Like I think developers like they sure like they write documentation, but it's not like again like the number one thing on the bucket list. And then now you're trying to force them to use a tool that will help them with this. I mean, they're just thinking like, maybe not, right? Like I don't really care that much. Like I don't really want to use it. I'll use it if like somebody forces me to use it. But then that's not really that great. And so like the people we were talking to, so we were trying to sell to big companies. We were talking to like managers, like VPs, etc. And they were like pretty on board, right, with with this idea and with the product and things like that. They were like they could see right how this would be super useful in their company. But the problem was they were having a hard time convincing their employees and the engineers on teams to like adopt the tool, because in order for the tool to actually work, you need the engineers to use the tool. And if you can't get the engineers to use the tool, then there's no point in using the tool. And so we ran into like this catch-22 kind of situation a lot. And so ultimately, I mean, we were talking about it, and I was like, we could spend like more time, right, to really try to figure out this space and like how to fix this catch-22. But at that point, I mean, I think I was starting to like lose a little bit of like interest and steam, I guess, in like trying to like slap this solution and like try to shape it into something that like would satisfy the engineers and things like that. Because like I was thinking about it and I was like, maybe this isn't as big of a problem, right? And wouldn't pick up as traction and things like that as big as we initially thought. Because when I first thought about it, I was like, this is a big problem, right? But then maybe like we were thinking about it, it's like, okay, this problem might be like decently big, right? But maybe we're just not doing it right. Like maybe we're not solving the problem in the way it should be solved. And maybe this is why developers don't want to use our tool, because the product kind of sucks. Maybe it doesn't work, and it doesn't solve the problem at hand. And so from there, we were like trying to, I guess, figure out how to move forward. And so at that point, I was like, maybe we should like leave the documentation space, pivot to something else. And so we were talking about it for quite a bit of time. And ultimately, I was like, you know what? None of the like stuff. We came up with a bunch of pivot ideas, and we're like talking them through. And I was just like, these aren't giving the same spark and passion that I initially had, right? When I was working on the documentation tool, like I knew this is what I wanted to work on. But then listening to all those pivot ideas and like coming up with them, it wasn't like what I really wanted to work on. And for me, like in order to, I guess, be the startup founder, to work on that thing for like, I guess, a big portion of my life, it would have to be something that I was passionate in. And so any of those things that we were talking about, like they were cool ideas, but they weren't things I would be interested like really work on as a founder. So from there I decided, okay, like I can't figure it out, right? Like what I would want to work on now. And so I was like, maybe I should just, finish my degree. And while I do that, like keep thinking, right? And maybe there's some experience I'll have, maybe something I'll learn, and gain a unique insight into some space, and then I can do something there. And so that's kind of where I've been, I guess, since then, is doing school, doing my thing, and then maybe there's a spark, right? And something will light that passion again. But at that time, right, like after those 3-4 months we were working on HyperDoc, right, like our company, it was clear to me that like there wasn't something that really drew the same kind of spark as like my meeting back in December, right, at that coffee shop. When I looked at that, I was like, this is it, right? This is what I wanted to work on. And so yeah, that's kind of where I decided to move on from then.
That's super interesting. I know, startups there's a lot of sort of time that goes into figuring out,
Yeah.
is it that like long project? A lot of these take a long time to grow. So I can definitely see that. From like I guess just a learning perspective, would you say after going through, I'd say quite a bit all the way from like entry to like, not, I don't mean exit as in like exit, but like, ending off at your startup, like, would you say you still want to keep building startups, or did you really enjoy co-op and you want to work, or, you're just unsure and just want to do it serendipitously?
Yeah. So in terms of like startups, I mean, so after having gone through that experience, I mean, I've garnered, I guess I have a newfound respect. I mean, I already knew startups were hard, right? But having gone through it, I mean, now like startup founders, like I know like the kind of stuff they have to go through, the kind of things that they face, right? Like firsthand. And so there is a level of, I guess, deeper respect for people who do startups and work at least as a founder or like an early employee and things like that. The company, like you have no idea like what you're doing really, at least in the beginning, and you're trying to like shape it and move it towards what you want it to become. And it just feels oftentimes there can be a lot of resistance just from the ambiguity and the uncertainty. And so, I mean, I like uncertainty. I like risk. I like those kinds of things. So like a startup is pretty, like at least working in the startup world, being a founder, like I can definitely see that in the future for me. I still love startups, and I still love hearing about people's ideas and what they're working on and things like that, because yeah, just for me, it's super interesting, right? All the big companies came, like at least I guess tech companies, I should say, a lot of tech companies came from like being that scrappy type of startup, right? Like Google started in a garage, for example, or like Apple, right? It was Steve and Steve. And so like going from that, right? And then now we can see kind of really how that came to be, right? Like the journey that companies take. And so I think there's something special in that, right? Ideas have to start somewhere. Without like, being a scrappy startup in the garage, right? I mean, or like Google deciding to do what it did, then I mean today might not exist. So
Yeah.
there are like I think startups
Absolutely.
I mean the ones, obviously a lot of most fail, right? Like most startups fail. But if you don't try it, if you don't give it a shot, then it's never gonna work, right? So you give it a shot, and then maybe you can do something great, right? And make that startup into something maybe in 40, 50 years or whatever becomes, a giant. And so, yeah, I mean, if people have ideas, I highly recommend, right? Like if you have something that you really want to work on and there's that spark, you really found something that you're passionate about and you think you can make it work, go for it, right? Like just do it. Because if you're not going to make it work, right? Like maybe somebody else might, but maybe it won't work out if they do it, right? Like if you want to do it, I think, and you think you should be the one to do it, then just do it. Because, yeah, like if you don't try it out, your vision will never really be like the one that comes out, right? So, yeah.
For sure. And, just on that note, like I know myself and a lot of the friends I speak with, like we all struggle a bit when we're thinking about these like opportunities and the opportunity costs with a lot of this stuff, right? You have potentially a bunch of co-ops in front of you and maybe multiple ideas that you want to pursue that you're passionate about. And, just this blend of like the conviction behind certain ideas and opportunity costs and sort of how you think about that, I think plays a significant role when you have a lot of opportunities in front of you.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've been in that position a lot as well. You know, the startup that you were presented with, I'm sure you had to weigh different opportunities against it. So how do you sort of go about navigating and thinking about opportunity cost?
Yeah, so the way I like to think about things, this is like, I guess, my kind of life decision making process. It's quite, I would say, oh, well, it's not easy, but it's quite simple recipe, right? Like it's when you make a decision, right? You consider like all the sorts of factors and things like that, pros and cons, etc., whatever it is that you kind of use to, make decisions there. I think, but the biggest decision, like driving factor, should be like making the best possible decision given the current like facts, right? Like at that point, right? Let's say, right, like back in December, right? At that point, right, I'm presented with like either side, right? I'm looking, I could, finish my degree, right? Get a stable job, etc., or I could take this opportunity. And I was like, which one would I like want to do more than the other, right? And you just make a decision because oftentimes people struggle with making like these decisions because they're always like going back and forth, like which one might be better, would I regret which one, kind of going back and forth. And I think spending too much time like dwelling on that thing is probably worse than picking either option because regardless, right, if you pick either option, like at least you've made the decision, right? And now you can move forward and make more decisions going forward. And so I think deciding, right, which one is the best decision for me given the current given my current experiences and knowledge, right? Which one like would I want to do more? And that's fine because in the future, right, you can't just go back and be like, okay, I wish I hadn't done that. Like I wish I hadn't made that decision. And you can't like think about that now, right? Like for example, if I'm going forward from now, I can't be like, okay, in 10 years, what if I look back and say I regretted that decision, right? Like, no, you can't do that. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck, right, in this endless loop of like, oh my God, what if I pick the other one I regretted like 10 years later, like whatever, right?
Yeah.
If you do end up regretting that decision, that's okay. Maybe it is true that in 10 years or 5 years, whatever it is, you end up regretting the decision you made like the years ago, right? That's okay. But at least you made that decision. And you have to look back and you can't say, right, like, I should have never done that. Because if you look back and say that, then something must have been wrong. Because when you made that decision, it should have been the decision that you wanted to make at that time. And so looking back, you could regret. You could be like, okay, after those 5 years, I felt like I wasted my life. Like that's fine. But you can't be like, okay, I shouldn't have made that decision because like you made that decision, right? You did. And you did it and you made the best possible one you could. And so I think moving forward, that's kind of how people should think about things, right? Like when you make a decision in life, decide, right, which one's best for you now, because that's what you have to do now. You can't start thinking like, oh, in the future, I'm looking back and thinking all of that kind of thing because yeah, like regardless, I mean, the path isn't made yet, right? You decide how to make your path. And so I think that might help when people are like thinking about navigating, like, what should I do? How do I move forward and things like that.
No, that's, yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said there, I think serendipity always ends up working really nicely.
Yeah.
That up to the moment. And I know you mentioned that you're not, you're sort of mapping or trying to see, different, see if you can come up with new ideas as you're going, or, different sparks would come up. But, when you get an idea, or, when you had that, had the documentation tool, idea presented in front of you, how did you sort of get the conviction behind that? Like, do you know what fueled that passion in you, or is it just things you really love to do and that's sort of it?
So this is kind of, I mean, oftentimes I find good startups come from like just things that you experience day to day, right? Problems that you experience. So in order to make a good startup, like this is something we learned, I guess, partly through YC, but also just like through experience. Startups solve problems, right? You want to make something that will solve a problem, make something people want. That is YC's like motto, right? Make something people want. And you need to essentially make something people want. And what better thing to make than making something that you would want, right? Like making something that you would want, chances are there are other people that are just like you, right? And if you make something that you would really want to use, chances are other people that are like you also want to use the same thing. And so that's, I think, starting out, I personally can't think of like a way to like I can't sit down and be like, I want to make a startup. Like, I don't think that is the right way of thinking about it because I can't, like at that point, I'm not thinking about like I'm not thinking about startups the right way, right? If I'm just down, I'm like, I want to make a startup. I don't
I
think I
really
would be
agree.
able to come up with a good idea. It would have to be something you kind of just do, right? Like you work on something, maybe it's a side project you're working on, maybe it's a problem you face in your day-to-day life, something you were thinking like, I wish this was better. I wish I had this. And the minute you start thinking about things like that, right? Like I wish I had X, I wish I had Y. That's my style of thinking about startups, I think. When I was presented with like the documentation problem, it was something I faced personally. Like at companies, I remember the crappy documentation I had to deal with, the outdated, people just not writing documentation, things like that. And I like looked at that and I was like I face this like every day, right? Day to day, this is a problem I face. And I was like, I wish this were better. And so I think from there, right? Like if you have something like a problem you face and you want to fix it, right? I think that's the conviction that kind of brings you forward and like moves you along. At least for me personally, that's how kind of how it works. So yeah, I think that's at least how I go about things, and probably many other people go about that the same way. Um, Start looking in like your day to day things that you face, problems that you encounter, and things you wish you could make better.
Okay. So for our last question, we normally ask about like advice. So I guess you can answer it in two ways. So it's either like, what's the best advice you've ever received, or like, what's the
Sure. I
advice you'd like
guess
to give to our
over the course
listeners?
of our talk, I mean, I guess I have given some sort of advice. I think that like, the primary one that for me, like the biggest
Yeah,
driving
for
thing
sure,
is that
for sure.
decision making. I think that applies to like almost every aspect of life, right? Um, I think making the decision is better, right? Even if you make the lesser of the two, it's better than not making a decision at all, right? I think you can't get stuck on trying to figure out, it's like spending too much time like dwelling, right, or thinking about which one to go with. What is right, what is wrong, that kind of thing. Taking risks, for example, right? Like personally, I like taking risks. I know people like other people might not be as comfortable taking risks, but like at that point when you're thinking about things like that, right? Like for example, one common thing I get from people is like, okay, I got a job on Waterloo Works, or I got a job somewhere, but then I got this other job, right? And I am in this trouble where like I accepted this job and I don't really want to work there, and I have this other job off. Like I might get the job, but I'm not sure. But this other job I got, like it's stable, I want to take it, right? Like just because I got it and not because I want to work there. Like when people are thinking about like, okay, when they're in that kind of situation, they're really stuck, right? I think what you should consider is like, okay, right, just break it down and be like, do I want to work at that job, right? And the answer is no, then don't work there. Like don't just I think people when they like decide they don't want to take that risk, right? And they don't want to like ruin everything. But I mean, if you really don't want to work there, right? Or if you don't really want to do like something, just don't do it, right? Even if it's because it's the safer option, right? I think like obviously there is some merit in like picking the safer option, right? But I think as a young person, right, as like we're not we're not like we're okay if we get like kicked down, right? And we're okay if things don't go our way. And so I think like when people are considering options and like which decisions to make, right? If there is a decision that you're only solely taking because it's the safer one, I think people should like, just think, right? Like if I really don't want to do this thing, like just if you don't want to do it, don't do it. Just go with the other one, right? Even if it's like, oh, now you have no job, right? Hey, it's okay, right? Like you can keep going and finding a job and doing those things, you can keep going. And so I think like when people are considering that, at least making those decisions, they should just, go with that, right? Go with something and make up their mind instead of like, going back and forth too much. Obviously, that I mean, I don't mean like okay, just like make the decision right away. Don't like rush it, but like spend the time you need thinking about it, right? Obviously, carefully consider both options or carefully consider the options presented. But then once you pick one, go with it, commit, right? And I think that will help a lot in terms of like getting past um, like the indecisiveness of people, right? I think naturally we tend to be a lot of indecisive when we don't know. When we're faced with two options and we don't know the outcomes, we tend to be very indecisive and going back and forth a lot. But I think you just carefully consider the options and you just move forward, and it's okay, right? You just go down one path and explore. I think that's probably the best way to make, like, at least going through the decision-making process.
That's super good advice. I think that's a good note to close. Thanks so much. It's been such a great pleasure to learn more about all of your diverse and impressive experiences. This has been an amazing episode with another brilliant mind from our very own University of Waterloo. So that's it, folks. See you next time with another episode on the Waterloo Advantage.